Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jill Johnson, and I'm the Executive Director for the International Society for Quality of Life Studies, better known as ISQOLS. And we're very, very pleased to have you all joining us today for this free webinar. We'll introduce our speaker in a moment. Just want to make sure that we all understand some of the basic housekeeping rules of our webinar. We would ask that you please keep yourself muted and your video off just to preserve bandwidth. As a reminder, this is being recorded. We will be posting this to our YouTube channel. However, for the first couple of weeks, it will be available only to our members on our membership forum. Now, we are extending a free trial offer to anyone who participates in this webinar. So after the webinar, we'll be sending you a link to become a member for free to ISQOLS for 3 whole months. So you'll get access not only to this webinar, but to all of our other webinars and materials and resources on our membership forum. So I hope you take advantage of that. In the meantime, just make sure that as you are staying quiet during this webinar presentation, if you would like to take your cursor down to the chat bar and feel free to ask any questions or put in any comments. We will have time for a question and answer period at the end. And so we'll be sure to address that. At that time, you are welcome to unmute yourself, show your video and ask your question, or we can also facilitate that for you. Let's go ahead and introduce our speaker with all that said. Again, this is a real pleasure for us, a privilege to have Richard Heinberg. Richard is the author of 14 books, including The Party's Over, Peak Everything, The End of Growth, and Our Renewable Future. He is Senior Fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute and is widely regarded as one of the world's most effective communicators in the urgent need to transition away from fossil fuels. He lives in Santa Rosa, California. His presentation today is Power, Limits and Prospects for Human Survival, What's in the Book. With that, Richard, I'll turn it over to you. So I'll stop sharing and feel free. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jill. And I'm just getting my PowerPoint going here. It takes a moment to click all the right buttons. There we go. Okay, so this is a book that I spent last 3 years writing, and it's really the culmination of my career as an author. And its objective is not to propose some new whiz-bang solution to all of our global problems. It's really to help us kind of step back and see the big picture and understand it with hopefully some wisdom. So the book was motivated by 3 questions, and these questions have been percolating in my mind for as long as I've been able to think for myself, certainly my whole adult life. But I've tried to formulate them as clearly as possible. One, how has just one species out of millions become so powerful? Powerful enough to bring our planet to the brink of climate chaos and a mass extinction. Second, why and how have we developed so many ways of exploiting and oppressing one another? We've gotten better at this than any other social species on the planet. And finally, is it possible to change our relationship with power so as to avert what looks like it may be an ecological catastrophe while also reducing social inequality? Okay, so that's enough to focus on for a book for an hour. So what's power, and why talk about power? Well, power is, the English word power covers a lot of territory. Some other languages use different words to describe some of these meanings, but for English, the most basic meaning of the word power, the one that any physicist would recognize, is the rate of energy transfer. Energy is essential for everything we do. and having more energy enables us to do more. So power is also the ability to do something. We speak of the power of flight or the power of speech. But then often when we use the word, we're talking about social power. So if power is the ability to do something, social power, it could be described as the ability to get somebody else to do something or other people to do something. And there are two different kinds of social power. One is horizontal power, where we all just agree to do something together. And vertical social power is where one person or a small group has the influence or the ability to get others to do things that may be against their wishes or interest even. So that involves incentives and threats. And finally, the power of ideas, inspiration, love. Those are all perfectly good meanings and usages for the word power. And ultimately, they are all related. At the most basic level, they're related because, as I said earlier, everything we do involves energy. So if you want to understand an organism, ecosystem, a society, anything, follow the energy. I say follow the money. Well, yeah, that's true in politics, but money is just a symbol of energy, really. Without energy, you can't do nothing. And power is everywhere, therefore. And I spend the first chapter of the book looking at power in nature and in evolution. And one sort of gee whiz takeaway from that is the immense power of life itself. Gram for gram, the average organism is 10,000 times as powerful as the sun. That seems crazy until you actually do the math. It works because the sun is extremely massive. Now, of course, the power of life, of organisms, of ourselves as living beings is derivative. It ultimately comes from sunlight, whereas the sun is producing its own power. But nevertheless, it's clear that life has gotten extremely good at aggregating and applying power. So what does it do with that power? Well, evolutionary biologists have agreed that the maximum power principle is a guiding force in the process of evolution. Well, what is that? Well, it's this very simple principle that the organism is able to focus the most power on obtaining food and reproducing is going to be more successful than competing organisms. Okay. But so then why don't we just have one organism that has taken over the whole earth? Well, in a sense, we have human beings. Well, I'll talk about that later. But throughout most of Earth's history, what we saw instead was the diversification of life. Well, why is that? It's because there's so many ways of exerting power and so many different environments in which to do so. So that's been the source of life's immense variety. Beauty has its own power. And Darwin realized that when he wrote his second book. His first, of course, was The Evolution of Species, but the second was on sexual selection. The problem that bugged him was the peacock's tail. Here was this very beautiful feature of a bird, but what was its evolutionary advantage in terms of natural selection? It made the peacock an easier target for predators. It was a heavy thing to carry around. Well, the solution was it was a way of attracting mates. Peacocks and peahens had decided that this was a criterion for mate selection, and as a result, peacocks engaged in a kind of evolutionary battle to see who could grow the biggest and most brightest and most colorful tail. Well, the production of beauty has proliferated throughout nature. Nature is intentionally beautiful. Nature devotes enormous amounts of resources to producing beauty, and human beings do as well. And this, I'll circle back around to this later on, but it's a really important thing to understand. So chapter 2 is about the evolution of human power in the Pleistocene. last 3 million years or so, during which various human species evolved. Over the last 300,000 years or so, Homo sapiens, our species, but even during that time, for the most of the time, there were several Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, and others. And many of them, or if not all, had tools, stone tools, wooden tools, skin, sinew, so on. But one species ended up surviving and the rest didn't. So what was the special sauce that enabled sapiens to outcompete the others? Nobody knows, but the best guess is probably had a lot to do with language, because language enabled us to teach one another how to make better and more effective tools and use them. And over time, it had side effects like asking questions. Where did the world come from? Where do we go when we die? So religion has been a kind of a side effect of the acquisition of language. And talk more about that later. In the Holocene, the last 10, 11,000 years, this is the subject of chapter 3 of the book, vertical social power emerged. Previous to this time, we had derived our energy from food, and our food from hunting and gathering. And that way of life, it was many ways of life, actually, because, it could be fishing, it could be nuts and berries, it could be, hunting big game animals. And each of those choices encouraged or imposed different kinds of ways of social organization. Nevertheless, they mostly had the characteristic of being organized horizontally. So nobody had the power to force other people to do things against their will. If a bully arose within the community, and it was always a man, coincidentally, could just be ostracized. And people with language, people could plot against him and kill him or drive him away. People did have influence and situational authority. If somebody knew more about herbs or the local geography, people would listen to them. But that didn't mean that they could tell everybody else what to do. But with grain agriculture, that changed, because grains could be stored and therefore taxed. And societies were becoming more numerous, bumping up against each other, becoming more warlike. There was more conflict over resources, and that drove societies to become more centralized in their authority structures. So the emergence of the state, roughly 7,000 years ago, was a key watershed in human societies, because now we have stratified societies, full-time division of labor. Money appears in these societies, cities, metal weapons, communication technologies, starting with writing, and social complexity, including slavery. All of these societies were slave societies. And they were formidable, as opposed to other surrounding human societies that maintained their horticultural or hunting and gathering ways of life. So they gradually grew in extent, most notably over the last 500 years with the European takeover of the rest of the planet. But they didn't grow that rapidly. It was a very gradual process in most cases, and it was characterized by cyclical behavior. Peter Turchin, who is an insect ecologist, solved a lot of basic theoretical problems in that field. A number of years ago, decided to take his statistical methods of study and apply them to another interesting problem, which is human social evolution. And he and a whole group of colleagues have built up a database of quantifiable information about human societies, hundreds of them. And in examining that database, they've isolated the cyclical behavior that seems to be true of many, if not all, complex human societies, where wealth is continually being funneled upward, a kind of wealth pump. Again, in complex human societies with agriculture, toward the elites who make the rules of the society, so that this happens increasingly. But you can't get blood out of a stone once the true wealth producers of society, the peasants and the farmers and the enslaved persons and so on, have been impoverished beyond a certain point. They can't pay any more taxes. The whole thing starts to come apart. They rebel. And so collapse is a normal and predictable feature of complex human societies. So all of this process goes on until chapter 4 of the book. And we get to a couple of hundred years ago, when the most momentous change in human social evolution takes place, really, in terms of human impact on one another and on the environment, and that's the fossil fuel revolution. You remember, energy is necessary for everything we do. With fossil fuels, we suddenly gained access to tens of millions of years of ancient sunlight that nature had stored and transformed into usable forms. And we used that energy for absolutely everything. This revolution almost got started in China about 1,000 years ago, because they had the prerequisites. They had coal. The Chinese had coal. They had incentives for innovation. There was lots of new technology being invented then, private ownership of land and other resources. But the Chinese authorities saw this as a threat, and they shut it down. So it got started instead and kept going in Britain about 700 years later, and the rest is history. This is what agriculture looked like before fossil fuels. This is what it looks like today. So it takes a lot less people to grow food. This is a little graph from the USDA. It's a little misleading because it says farm jobs as a percentage of total US jobs. Well, in 1790, did all those people have jobs on the farm? No, they were small landholders, or they were enslaved persons, but they didn't have farm jobs. The whole idea of employment as a normal way of, taking care of the mass of the human population and guiding their efforts throughout the day and so on, that's a very recent development. Again, largely resulting from fossil fuels. Once you only needed a small percentage of people with, fossil fuel machinery to produce enough food for everybody else. What do the rest of those people do? Well, they move to cities, and they find employment in productive activities, in administration and monitoring and distribution and advertising and so on. We'll get to that in a moment. So available energy explodes. Since the start of the Industrial Revolution around 1800, per capita energy usage globally has grown 800%, 8 times over, and that's per capita. And meanwhile, the number of capitas has also grown as a result of using fertilizer, industrial agriculture, medicines made with fossil fuels, sanitation chemicals made with fossil fuels, and all the rest. Now more people survive to old age. Population has grown from 1 billion to almost 8 billion. So that's also an 800% increase. Well, success, right? That's biological success, but it's a perilous kind of success, because if anything is growing at even 1% annual rate, that implies a doubling time. It's doubling in size every 70 years. If it's growing at 3%, let's say, well, it's doubling in size every 24, 25 years. And that's what's been happening with the global economy for decades now. And we look at that and we say, great, even faster. But that means that the rate at which we're extracting renewable and non-renewable resources is doubling every short period of time. The rate at which we're dumping wastes into the environment, including carbon emissions, is doubling in every short period of time. Well, relatively early in the fossil fuel period, it was discovered that, with applying all of this energy, we could make stuff faster than people would ordinarily want to or be able to buy it. And this created a couple of problems: overproduction and underemployment, which led to the Great Depression. So all the best minds applied themselves to this problem. How do we solve this problem? And the solution that was come up with was a new way of organizing the economy, which came to be called consumerism. So using advertising to talk people into wanting more stuff, and consumer credit into enabling them to consume now and pay later, and then valorizing the whole thing. The US federal government started calling people not just citizens, but consumers. That was our job in life, was to consume more stuff in order to keep the economy growing, so as to create new jobs, more profits for industry, more returns for investors, more tax revenues for government. What was not to like? So the economy, for the very first time in human history, became a thing to be named and measured using GDP, with growth as the ultimate goal. Now, this is a little picture of the economy that I grabbed off the internet from Investopedia, and it's taught in every economics textbook 101. But what's missing here? How about the earth, where all the natural resources come from that get made into consumer products and ultimately into waste? The earth is not infinite in size, it's finite. And so the continual growth in resource extraction and waste dumping can't go on forever. And as a result, we're getting ourselves into a lot of problems. My basic argument in the book is that we are, as a species, we have become over-empowered as a result of fossil fuels, and we are overpowering nature and one another. And it's not just climate change. I'll talk about climate change in a moment, but it's loss of wild nature, natural resources, pollution levels. The Global Footprint Network keeps track of how we're doing in this regard. And they say we're using over a planet and a half's worth of resources every year. How's that even possible? By stealing from the future, stealing from future generations. Then, it's not just the number of species that's declining, it's the number of individuals within most species that are disappearing. And this is a little graphic from World Wildlife Fund that's actually several years old now, and it's outdated. The numbers for land-based species are now, they're saying, actually, with more recent measurements, close to 70%. Same with insects. You used to drive your car for a couple of hours and come back with the windscreen almost covered with dead insects. Doesn't happen now. All those insects are gone. Well, how about climate change? We tend these days to subsume all of our environmental problems under this one category of climate change. And my argument in the book is that climate change is all about power. How so? Well, it's obviously a problem for the power of the fossil fuel industry to prevent us from dealing with carbon emissions and transitioning to other energy sources and so on. But I think it goes deeper than that. Climate change is not just a technical problem of carbon emissions with the technical solution of building a bunch of new machinery. I worked with a colleague, David Fridley, of the energy analysis team at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory for a year to produce this study, Our Renewable Future, which you can download for free at ourrenewablefuture.org. And we looked in detail at what it would take to transition entirely to solar and wind. We didn't look so much at nuclear because The general consensus of energy experts now, there are holdouts, but the general consensus is it's too slow, too expensive, and it's just not going to be ready for us. And there's unsolved problems, of course, with waste dumping and all the rest. So what about solar and wind? Well, they're intermittent sources of power. The sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow. Well, there are solutions to that. Energy storage, batteries, for example. Well, it takes energy to make batteries, and that energy is often not included in the equations. It also takes materials. Sunlight and wind themselves are renewable, but the technologies we use to capture them are made out of high-grade sand, aluminum, steel, concrete, and more. And those materials are finite. So there's a problem of resource extraction. And what's another way to solve the intermittency problem? Source redundancy. Just build way more of these machines than you'll actually need on a sunny or windy day, with the hope that if you connect them over a wide enough area, if the wind is calm and it's cloudy in one place, you'll be able to borrow energy from someplace else. Then there's demand management, just not using energy when it's not available. People don't like that. When they like to be able to use energy whenever they want it. All of those solutions work, but they're all costly, and they imply trade-offs, as does the 20% conundrum. Only 20% of our energy currently is used in the form of electricity. The other 80% is used in the form of solid, liquid, gaseous fuels for all kinds of different things, almost all of our transportation, including not just cars. Yeah, we can all buy electric cars, but shipping, long distance trucking, aviation, those are going to be much more difficult to substitute. Now, you could run aviation, for example, by taking solar electricity and using it to electrolyze water, produce hydrogen, combine hydrogen with carbon from the atmosphere or other stuff, and make like methanol, for example. That would work as a aircraft fuel. But the inefficiencies and costs involved would be really substantial. We're not looking at an easy transition of aviation or a cheap result. And you see that everywhere you look. High heat industrial processes, making cement for concrete. Nobody has a cement kiln right now that is low carbon. So the infrastructure that's required is not just a lot of solar panels and wind turbines. It's really a replacement of nearly all the industrial infrastructure that we've built over the last 100 years. And we're talking about doing that in the next 20. So building new infrastructure actually requires energy, and a lot of it. So if we tried to keep doing everything we're doing now, running a consumer economy, flying off for vacations, or ordering stuff on Amazon Prime and having it dropped off at your front door, if we try to do all of that and do this immense energy transition where we're manufacturing at enormous scale, all this stuff, the result is going to be a big boost in carbon emissions. The only way, sorry, we can hear you. The only way around that is to actually reduce our energy usage during the process of transition. And that's what world leaders don't want to talk about. It's what they're not talking about at COP26 right now. But it's the same thing with all the other crises that over-empowerment is creating for us. Economic inequality. Can we solve that just with more economic growth? That's how we've been trying to solve it internationally and within nations for the last umpteen decades. But in fact, economic growth tends to provoke more economic inequality unless we systematically try to reverse that process. So here's a question. Are we even capable of power self-limitation? If all of these problems are the result of too much power, well, has evolution just designed us to self-destruct? There's some people who think so. It's a very cynical way of looking at things. But my view in the book is that, in fact, power self-limitation is just as much our evolutionary heritage as power maximization. I name this as the optimum power principle, and it's everywhere. It's in homeostasis, the power balancing act that goes on moment by moment within cells and organisms, predator-prey relationships, and within human societies, going all the way back to hunter-gatherer times and all the way forward to the modern industrial world. We still try to limit power. We try to keep despots and dictators from arising through democracy. We use financial regulations to keep rich people from cheating everyone else and into getting even richer. We use environmental regulations and so on. We know that it's necessary to limit power, and we try to do so in lots of different ways. But if we can, why aren't we doing it sufficiently? Why are all these problems converging, problems of power? Well, there are a lot of different explanations, and in the book I discuss them. But the one that I think is most important to understand is just that fossil fuels have given us so much power so fast that we've developed this mindset that we can solve all of our problems just by throwing more energy at them. You know, with agriculture, we were destroying the fertility of soils around the world with modernizing agricultural techniques, depleting soil of minerals and nutrients and so on. So we solved it. We threw some energy at the problem by creating, with natural gas and other fossil fuels, creating artificial fertilizers. And so food production goes up as a result. We got the idea in our heads that we could solve all human problems that way, just by throwing more energy at the problem. Inequality, population growth, none of these are problems, because we'll just grow our way out of the problem. But if growth is part of the problem itself, then can it actually be the solution? I don't think so. And this is the relevance, I think, for your organization, quality of life studies, because if we can't promise everyone more goodies, more of the same, more economic growth as measured by GDP, then what's the point? Who's going to sign on? Well, it has to be quality of life. We have to make a shift from concentrating on material throughput, energy throughput, GDP, and concentrate instead on making people's lives better. And what makes people's lives better? A healthy natural world, a healthy diet, cultural activities. And very few of those actually require that much energy or resources. So the last chapter in the book is about the future of power. What do we have in front of us? It's a spectrum of possibilities, from collective self-annihilation to sufficient self-restraint. Our current path is not a good one. And that's partly because we haven't named the problem correctly. We think that just by adjusting the dials on carbon emissions or economic growth, we can solve all these problems, but we won't. It's like Greta Thunberg says about the people inside the COP26 negotiations. It's all blah, blah, blah. What do we have to self-limit? A lot of things, including land usage. We have to leave more of ocean and land area for other species to recuperate. So our deep future, if we understand these things, our deep future actually could be beautiful. We're a uniquely powerful species in terms of our abilities, tool making, language, and all the rest. What can we do with these abilities that won't get us in trouble? Well, make the world a more beautiful place. We've been doing that for a long time, and traditional cultures even destroyed capital that might be used in enlarging society's throughput. They deliberately destroyed capital in seasonal celebrations, in potlatches, in gift giving, and in building cathedrals later on, and so on, today, if we have leftover capital, we want to reinvest it so that we can grow the economy. That's exactly the wrong thing to do with surplus. The best thing to do with it is enjoy it, is to make life beautiful, improve your quality of life. So there are a lot of organizations already working on various aspects of the problem of power. All of them, I think, need to link up and understand that they're ultimately working on one thing, one solution to the one problem of humanity. And if we can do that, I think we can make it through. So last slide. This is from Lao Tzu, my favorite philosopher of all time, ancient Chinese. Knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is wisdom. Mastering others is strength, but mastering yourself is true power. So with that, let's see if you have any thoughts or comments. Let's have a discussion.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. Really, really insightful. And I'm looking forward to seeing if anyone has any questions or comments. We do have the chat bar. You can feel free to enter your question or comment there, or just simply, I think you can raise your hand or even unmute yourself and go for it. While we're waiting for that, I just wanted to ask you a simple question. My brother actually was a huge fan of yours about 10 years ago. He was studying sustainability at the Arizona State University, and your book was one of his textbooks. And I remember us having a discussion about it. And I asked him at that time, do you have any hope for the future? And he said, not really. And I asked him, he's actually living in China, and I asked him now, what question would you like me to ask Richard Heinberg? And he said, ask him if he has any hope, if his hope has changed in the last 10 years.
Yeah. Well, it depends on how you define hope.
True.
For a lot of people, what they're hoping for is more of the same. And it's entirely understandable. Their hope is that, the remainder of their lives will be relatively comfortable. And for their children and grandchildren, life will be somehow recognizable, and there won't be catastrophes to deal with and so on. I don't have much hope that any of that will be the case. But I look upon hope as more an active choice of saying, okay, this is what we're faced with. How do we make the best of it? How do we get through this immediate set of challenges and move toward a long-range future that's actually really, worth fighting for? How do we make ourselves as a species worthy of survival? Not many people ask that question.
Very
so
true.
To me, that's hope. Thank you.
Good, thank you. I see a hand raised. Feel free to unmute yourself. I'm not sure what the first name is.
Hi, this is Alexandra.
Oh, hi, Alexandra. Feel free.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. That was quite interesting, and it converges a lot with a lot of the studies in decision making. But as far as I know, we still have one problem, is that it's not very clear where to start off. So some people argue that it's a good idea to start from education. Others think we should start from changing the economy structure. Others think that we should start by changing our belief systems, including religions, and yeah. So what is your opinion about this?
Yeah, well, I think we have to do all of those things and see what gets us the most traction. We do have to change the economy, but I don't think we can change the economy until more people understand what the problem and the possibilities are. And here again, I think quality of life studies can play an enormous role in helping people understand that our current economy is not geared toward improving people's quality of life. That could be a side effect, but that's not what policymakers aim for. They're just aiming for growth in GDP, which then means growth in material throughput and waste dumping, which creates more climate change. So they're trying to solve climate change with the very thing that's creating it. People need to understand that there's a different way, that by focusing on quality of life, it opens up the possibility of living with less, but having a more secure future for ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, and enjoying life more.
Sorry, if I may, just one quick answer. I think quality of life research has been showing that for quite a while.
Yes.
But I would dare to say that as a community, I personally feel that we don't have enough power to actually make that point. So, yeah. Yeah,
I know. And that's one of the paradoxes that I identify in the book. Most people who are involved in any of these, habitat preservation, peace negotiations, whatever, are relatively powerless compared to the people who are at the top of the social pyramid. But the people at the top of the social pyramid are actually impaired by their own vertical social power. Social psychology experiments and research have shown that people with a lot of social power tend to have very little empathy and very little understanding of larger systems and how they work. And those are the people we're putting in charge of things. So we can't look to them to solve these problems. We have to self-organize with and by working together across the silos. So peace movement, economic inequality, anti-racism, habitat preservation, global peace studies, all of these things need to understand that they're actually working together in the same direction. Stop competing with each other for foundation funding and all the rest, and really come together. That's the only way that I see this possibly working.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great point that you made, that we have been showing this in many of our research circles, but our power is limited. Excellent point. Cornelia, you have a question. Feel free to.
Yeah, thank you so much. Fascinating presentation. I have two questions actually, which are related. On the one hand, if you have seen, since you have been monitoring quite extensively at a global level, have you seen any wake up element in a certain way as a reaction to COVID? And then related to that, it's very often that there is this energy wasted in the discussion, well, is it individual or institutional change that needs to happen first, falling under the table that it's actually a chicken and egg question, because ultimately one needs to happen so that the other one continues. So I wonder, what are your questions or your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Could you restate the second part of the question? The first one I got about COVID, but the second I'm not sure I quite understood. I was mulling my response to the first question as you were stating your second one.
Yeah. The second one was that there's very often this empty debate about, institutional change or individual change. Because
okay. Yeah. Okay.
We all agree, right, that power is also very often held within organizations, but then organizations are made up of people. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Okay, got it. So first of all, COVID has, I think, revealed a bifurcation that's taking place among nations and societies in the world. The societies that have a good foundation of social trust are doing much better. And in fact, in some of those countries, social trust has actually increased as a result of successful response to the pandemic. And in other countries, where social trust was already problematic, it's actually been reduced by the pandemic. And that's a real problem, because I don't see any way we're going to get through this century if we don't have a good foundation of social trust, because we're going to be sacrificing some comforts and conveniences and expectations inevitably. And there are two ways to go with that. One is, well, we agree that it's necessary, like in World War II, well, we're all contributing for the effort. We're willing to sacrifice for this long range goal. And in fact, it's making us better people and happier as a result of doing it. Or we can say, things aren't going according to my expectations. It must be somebody's fault. And I'm going to find out who that is and deal with them. And unfortunately, in the United States, I see us going down that latter path, and it's not good. And the pandemic has, I think, pushed us even further down that path. Somehow we've got to turn that around.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, individuals versus institution. We got to do both. We got to change our institutions from the inside so that they're more characterized by horizontal power and less by vertical power. And that is happening to a certain extent in many institutions. If we had longer, I could talk about, the cooperative movement and all of that. But that's a really important part of the work.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Cornelia. I think we might have time for maybe one more question or comment if anybody has any. While we're waiting for that, just want to remind everyone that we do have an international conference coming up in August of 2022, and the theme happens to be quality of life for resilient futures, sustainability, equity, and well-being. Where we're focusing on resiliency in the midst of post-pandemic era, as well as a particular focus on sustainability. It will be held in Vermont in USA, which is a great, as you know, center for discussing such ideas and such things. So we hope that you consider, if you're joining us, just as curious out of this particular webinar, if you would consider joining us for that conference. I don't see any other questions or comments, but so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Richard, it was indeed an incredible pleasure and privilege to have you speaking today. We'll be sure to order your book and make sure that we have it as a resource, especially here in ISQOLS. Do you want to remind everyone where they can get the book?
Well, yeah, there's a page at postcarbon.org, postcarbon.org.
Okay.
Just search for, Heinberg power, and it'll come up on Google. And also, I would point folks toward my webpage, which is richardheinberg.com. I have hundreds of essays going back years, including my most recent one on the energy crisis, the global energy crisis in Europe and America. That's up. And and our public website, resilience.org, which has a daily updated menu of articles from all different authors that are related in many cases to your interests, quality of life studies. Not always, but at least tangentially, almost everything will be of interest, I can guarantee. So those are useful resources. We have a video course, Think Resilience, that's extremely helpful for students and policymakers as well, and more. So that's all at postcarbon.org, resilience.org, and richardheinberg.com.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I'll be sure. So after the webinar, we'll be sure to send out the follow-up email, which includes information on the trial membership so everyone can join. And then we'll link everything that you discussed in this webinar on our membership forum. We have a very specific membership topic called environmental sustainability and quality of life, and we'll be sure to post this webinar as well as those links. Thank you again so much. This was an honor for me in particular to speak with you, and my brother will be excited to watch it later. So thank you so much. Thank you all to everyone who joined, and we hope to be in touch with you in the future, Richard.
Thank you. I hope so too.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Take care.